Hey guys, tonight we begin with something twisted, dark, and absolutely scandalous. Ancient Egypt and the dynasty that turned bloodlines into marriage certificates, sibling love into royal policy, and family trees into family circles. This isn't the Egypt of Hollywood movies or museum gift shops. This is the Egypt of pharaohs who believed their own divine hype so thoroughly that they literally married their sisters, their daughters, and occasionally their own mothers. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You wake up in ancient Memphis, capital of the greatest empire the world has ever known. The sun rises over the Nile like molten gold, casting long shadows across temples that dwarf anything you've ever seen. This is Egypt during the Ptolemaic dynasty, and you're about to witness something that would make even the most jaded reality TV producer blush. Because here, in the land of gods and pharaohs, royal marriage isn't about love, politics, or even alliance. It's about keeping the bloodline so pure that it practically glows in the dark. And by pure, we mean horrifyingly inbred. The year is 51 BCE, and you're standing in the Palace of Alexandria, watching as 18-year-old Cleopatra VII prepares for her wedding day. She's beautiful, intelligent, and speaks 9 languages. She's also about to marry her 10-year-old brother, Ptolemy XIII, because apparently in this family the phrase kissing cousins is for amateurs. This isn't some medieval European arrangement where distant relatives unite kingdoms. This is full-blown, no-holds-barred sibling matrimony, and it's been going on for 300 years. The Ptolemies didn't invent royal incest, but they perfected it like a grotesque art form. Starting with the Ptolemy III, one of Alexander the Great's generals who carved out Egypt as his personal kingdom after Alexander's death, this Greek dynasty established a simple rule: keep it in the family. And we mean really, really in the family. Over the course of their reign, the Ptolemies would produce 15 generations of pharaohs, and nearly every single one married a sibling, a half-sibling, or occasionally a parent. It wasn't a scandal, it was tradition. But why? Why would anyone look at their brother or sister and think, you know what? Marriage material. The answer lies in divine ideology and practical politics, twisted together like DNA strands that should never have met. The Ptolemies considered themselves gods on earth, literal descendants of Alexander the Great, and inheritors of Egyptian divine kingship. In their minds, their blood was so sacred, so pure, that mixing it with outsiders would be like diluting liquid gold with mud. Only another god could be worthy of a god's love. And conveniently, their siblings were the only other gods available. This divine narcissism created a family tree that looks more like a family pole. Brothers married sisters, uncles married nieces, and in at least one documented case, a pharaoh married his own daughter. The genetic implications were catastrophic, but the political advantages were clear. No foreign princes could claim the throne through marriage. No ambitious nobles could wed their way into power. The Ptolemies created a closed loop of royal authority that kept power concentrated in one increasingly unstable bloodline. The first major practitioner of this family policy was Ptolemy II, who married his full sister Arsinoe II in 275 BCE. This wasn't a quiet ceremony. It was a public celebration of divine incest, complete with festivals, coins depicting the happy couple, and poems praising their sacred union. The Greeks living in Egypt were initially horrified. Their own mythology was full of warnings about the dangers of such relationships. But the Ptolemies had an answer for everything. They pointed to Zeus and Hera, brother and sister rulers of Olympus, and said, "If it's good enough for the gods, it's good enough for us." And so the pattern was set. For the next 3 centuries, the Ptolemies would marry within their immediate family, with such consistency that their genealogical chart looks like a medical textbook on genetic disorders. Ptolemy III married his sister. Ptolemy IV married his sister. Ptolemy V married his sister. The pattern was so predictable that Egyptian priests probably kept a standard wedding ceremony script with blanks to fill in the names. But let's be clear about something. This wasn't just a royal quirk or a cultural oddity. This was a deliberate, systematic policy of genetic isolation that produced some of the most physically and mentally unstable rulers in human history. The later Ptolemies suffered from a spectacular array of health problems. Obesity, mental illness, physical deformities, and premature death were common. Several pharaohs were so inbred that they were essentially biological disasters held together by divine authority and loyal palace guards. Ptolemy VIII, nicknamed Physcon, or Fatty, was so grossly overweight that he couldn't walk without assistance. His body was a grotesque testament to generations of genetic roulette. He married his sister Cleopatra II, then later married his sister's daughter, Cleopatra III, making him simultaneously his wife's brother and stepfather. When the 2 Cleopatras inevitably fought over who was the real queen, Ptolemy VIII solved the problem by having his own son murdered and sending the boy's dismembered body to his mother as a wedding gift. This is what happens when you combine absolute power with chromosomal chaos. The psychological effects were equally devastating. Many Ptolemies displayed what can only be described as psychopathic behavior. They murdered siblings, parents, and children with casual brutality. They ordered mass executions for trivial slights. They declared themselves gods and demanded worship from subjects who could barely hide their revulsion. Whether this was the result of genetic damage, royal isolation, or simple corruption by power is impossible to determine. Probably all 3. Yet somehow this system worked. The Ptolemies ruled Egypt for nearly 300 years, longer than most normal dynasties. Their kingdom was wealthy, culturally sophisticated, and militarily powerful. Alexandria became the intellectual capital of the ancient world, home to the greatest library ever assembled, and scholars who advanced mathematics, astronomy, and medicine. The Ptolemies might have been genetically catastrophic, but they were also politically brilliant. They understood that Egypt was different from other Hellenistic kingdoms. The Egyptians had been ruled by god-kings for thousands of years. They expected their pharaohs to be divine, mysterious, and set apart from ordinary mortals. By marrying their siblings, the Ptolemies became more Egyptian than the Egyptians, more divine than the gods. Their incestuous marriages weren't seen as perverse by most of their subjects. They were seen as proof of royal sanctity. The Ptolemies also used their closed marriage system to prevent the succession crises that plagued other kingdoms. When every potential heir was related to every other potential heir, civil wars became family feuds. Brutal, yes, but contained. The kingdom didn't fragment into competing dynasties because there was only one dynasty. It might have been insane, but it was stable insanity. This brings us to the most famous Ptolemy of all, Cleopatra VII, the last pharaoh of Egypt. Cleopatra was the product of over 2 centuries of intensive inbreeding. Her family tree was so tangled that she probably had fewer unique ancestors than most people have great-grandparents. She was simultaneously related to herself through multiple bloodlines, a living embodiment of genetic concentration. And yet somehow Cleopatra was brilliant. She spoke multiple languages, understood complex politics, and commanded respect from Romans who generally considered foreign women to be barely human. She was beautiful, charismatic, and ruthless. Either she was a genetic miracle or the product of hybrid vigor from her family's occasional marriages to outsiders. Probably both. But even Cleopatra couldn't escape the family tradition. She married her younger brother Ptolemy XIII when she was 18 and he was 10. When that marriage became politically inconvenient, she had him murdered and married her even younger brother Ptolemy XIV. When he also became problematic, she had him killed too. By the time she was in her 20s, Cleopatra had married 2 brothers and killed both of them. This was considered normal Ptolemaic behavior. The irony is that Cleopatra's most famous relationships were with Romans who weren't her relatives. Her affairs with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony were scandalous, not because they were incestuous, but because they were foreign. For a Ptolemy, sleeping with a Roman was more shocking than sleeping with a sibling. But the Ptolemaic system was already doomed by Cleopatra's time. The genetic damage was too severe, the political pressures too great, and the Roman Empire too powerful. When Cleopatra died in 30 BCE, she took with her the last remnant of a dynasty that had ruled through incest for 3 centuries. The Romans, who had their own complex relationship with sexual morality, were nevertheless horrified by Ptolemaic marriage practices. They saw them as evidence of Egyptian decadence and barbarism. The Roman conquest of Egypt marked the end of the most successful incestuous dynasty in human history. But the Ptolemies weren't unique. Royal incest was practiced by ruling families across the ancient world, from the Achaemenid Persians to the Inca Empire. What made the Ptolemies special was their systematic approach and spectacular success. The Achaemenid Persians, who ruled the largest empire the world had ever seen, also practiced royal incest. Cambyses II married his sister Atossa. Darius I married his own daughter. Xerxes married his brother's daughter. Like the Ptolemies, the Persians justified this through religious ideology. They worshipped Ahura Mazda, the god of light, and believed that their royal blood was literally divine light made flesh. Mixing it with common blood would dim its sacred radiance. But the Persians were more casual about incest than the Ptolemies. They also married foreign princesses, noble daughters, and conquered queens. Their incestuous marriages were strategic choices, not absolute requirements. This probably saved them from the genetic disasters that plagued the later Ptolemies. The Romans, ironically, were both fascinated and repulsed by royal incest. They themselves practiced strategic marriage within extended family networks, but sibling marriage was considered abhorrent. When the Emperor Caligula allegedly had sexual relationships with his sisters, it was seen as evidence of his insanity. When Claudius married his niece Agrippina, it required a special law to make it legal. The Romans understood political marriage, but they drew the line at immediate family. This makes the later Roman Empire's relationship with Egyptian culture all the more complex. After conquering Egypt, the Romans adopted many Egyptian religious practices, artistic styles, and architectural forms. They imported Egyptian obelisks, built Egyptian-style temples, and worshipped Egyptian gods. But they never adopted Egyptian marriage practices. Roman emperors might declare themselves gods, but they didn't marry their sisters. The Inca Empire, isolated in the Andes Mountains, developed a form of royal incest that was even more extreme than the Ptolemies. The Sapa Inca, the emperor, was required to marry his full sister, called the Koya. This wasn't just tradition, it was cosmic necessity. The Incas believed that the royal bloodline descended directly from Inti, the sun god, and Mama Quilla, the moon goddess. Since the sun and moon were siblings, their earthly representatives had to be siblings too. Unlike the Ptolemies, who gradually developed their incestuous practices, the Incas made sibling marriage a fundamental requirement of kingship. A man couldn't become Sapa Inca unless he married his sister. If he didn't have a sister, he couldn't rule. This created a succession system that was even more genetically constrained than the Ptolemaic model. The results were predictably catastrophic. The later Inca emperors suffered from the same genetic problems as the Ptolemies: physical deformities, mental illness, and early death. The Spanish conquistadors reported that many Inca nobles were visibly inbred, with characteristic facial features and health problems. But like the Ptolemies, the Incas maintained their power through divine ideology and military force. The Spanish conquest of the Inca Empire in 1532 ended another incestuous dynasty, but the genetic damage persisted. Spanish records from the colonial period document the continued prevalence of genetic disorders among the descendants of Inca nobility. Generations of inbreeding had created a biological legacy that couldn't be easily reversed. But royal incest wasn't limited to ancient empires. It persisted well into the modern era, particularly among European royalty. The Habsburg Dynasty, which ruled much of Europe from the 15th to the 18th centuries, practiced strategic incest that gradually became pathological. The famous Habsburg jaw, a distinctive facial deformity, was the result of generations of cousin marriage and occasional uncle-niece unions. The Habsburgs weren't as extreme as the Ptolemies or Incas, but they were persistent. They married within their extended family network for over 2 centuries, gradually concentrating their bloodline until it became genetically unstable. Charles II of Spain, the last Habsburg king, was so inbred that he was physically and mentally disabled. He couldn't speak clearly, couldn't walk without assistance, and died without producing an heir. His death in 1700 triggered the War of Spanish Succession, one of the largest conflicts in European history. The Hawaiian royal family also practiced incest, though less systematically than other dynasties. Native Hawaiian culture considered royal brother-sister marriage to be the ideal form of union, believing that it preserved the sacred mana, or spiritual power, of the bloodline. But Hawaiian royalty also married outside their immediate family, preventing the extreme genetic concentration seen in other incestuous dynasties. What's fascinating about all these examples is how similar the justifications were. Whether Egyptian, Persian, Inca, or Hawaiian, royal families justified incest through divine ideology. They claimed that their blood was sacred, that their genes were literally divine, and that mixing with outsiders would contaminate their supernatural essence. This wasn't just political convenience, it was religious conviction. But there was always a practical element, too. Incestuous marriage prevented foreign influence, eliminated succession disputes, and concentrated political power. It was simultaneously a religious practice and a political strategy. The fact that it was also genetically disastrous was either unknown or considered irrelevant. Modern genetics has revealed just how dangerous these practices were. Studies of royal mummies, skeletal remains, and historical records have documented the devastating effects of prolonged inbreeding. The Ptolemies showed signs of everything from cleft palates to severe mental illness. The Incas suffered from dwarfism, epilepsy, and developmental disorders. The Habsburgs developed their characteristic facial deformities and reproductive problems. Yet, these dynasties often lasted longer than their genetically diverse counterparts. The Ptolemies ruled for 3 centuries. The Incas controlled a vast empire for over a century. The Habsburgs dominated European politics for 4 centuries. Somehow, genetic disaster coexisted with political success. The key was ideology. These rulers convinced their subjects that their genetic abnormalities were actually signs of divine favor. Physical deformities became marks of sacred distinction. Mental illness was interpreted as divine madness. Infertility was seen as proof that the gods were too holy to reproduce normally. This ideological framework was supported by elaborate court rituals, religious ceremonies, and artistic representations. The Ptolemies commissioned statues that idealized their features, hiding genetic defects behind stylized perfection. The Incas developed a complex mythology that explained their rulers' physical problems as cosmic necessities. The Habsburgs used portraiture and ceremonial clothing to minimize their facial deformities. But ideology alone wasn't enough. These dynasties also relied on sophisticated administrative systems, professional armies, and economic prosperity. The Ptolemies built one of the ancient world's greatest kingdoms through effective taxation, trade networks, and cultural patronage. The Incas created a remarkably efficient imperial system based on forced labor and resource redistribution. The Habsburgs maintained their power through diplomatic marriages, military alliances, and financial resources. In other words, successful incestuous dynasties weren't just genetically isolated, they were politically sophisticated. They understood that royal marriage was only one tool of statecraft, not the only tool. They compensated for their genetic weaknesses through institutional strengths. This brings us to an uncomfortable truth. Incest worked, at least in the short term. For rulers who prioritized political stability over genetic health, sibling marriage was often an effective strategy. It prevented succession crises, eliminated foreign influence, and created a distinctive royal identity. The long-term costs were catastrophic, but the short-term benefits were real. The question is whether modern people can learn anything from these historical examples. Obviously, we now understand the genetic dangers of inbreeding. We know that incest produces higher rates of genetic disorders, mental illness, and early death. We have scientific evidence that the ancient rulers lacked, but the political lessons are more complex. The incestuous dynasties succeeded because they created closed systems of power that were resistant to outside influence. They maintained control through ideological conviction, institutional effectiveness, and genetic exclusivity. In some ways, they were the ultimate expression of royal authority. Rulers who were literally and figuratively set apart from their subjects. Modern democracies, by contrast, are based on the opposite principle, that power should be open, competitive, and accessible to everyone. We reject the idea that some people are genetically suited to rule, while others are genetically suited to obey. We believe that political authority should be earned through merit, not inherited through bloodlines. Yet even modern societies struggle with dynastic politics. Political families like the Kennedys, Bushes, and Clintons in America, or the Gandhis in India, or the Le Pens in France, accumulate power across generations. They don't marry their siblings, but they do concentrate political authority within extended family networks. They create closed systems of influence that are resistant to outside challenge. The difference is that modern political dynasties have to compete in open elections. They can't simply declare themselves divine and demand obedience. They have to convince voters, respond to criticism, and adapt to changing circumstances. This makes them more flexible than their ancient counterparts, but also more vulnerable. The incestuous dynasties of the ancient world offer a cautionary tale about the dangers of closed systems. When power becomes too concentrated, when authority becomes too isolated, when rulers become too convinced of their own superiority, the results are often catastrophic. The Ptolemies, Incas, and Habsburgs all fell because they couldn't adapt to changing circumstances. Their genetic isolation became political isolation, and their political isolation became strategic weakness. Perhaps the most important lesson is that no system of government is permanent. The most successful dynasties eventually collapse, the most powerful empires eventually fragment, and the most sacred traditions eventually become historical curiosities. The pharaohs who considered themselves gods are now museum exhibits. The emperors who married their sisters are now cautionary tales. The kings who believed their blood was divine are now subjects of genetic studies. But their stories remain fascinating because they reveal something fundamental about human nature. The desire for power, the fear of contamination, the need for legitimacy, the willingness to sacrifice genetic health for political stability. These are universal human impulses. The specific forms change, but the underlying motivations remain constant. The Ptolemies married their siblings because they believed it would preserve their divine essence. Modern politicians marry within their social class because they believe it will preserve their cultural advantages. The mechanisms are different, but the goal is the same: to maintain power by controlling reproduction. This is why the story of royal incest matters. It's not just a historical curiosity or a genetic cautionary tale. It's a window into the fundamental tension between power and biology, between political necessity and genetic health, between short-term advantage and long-term survival. The emperors who married their sisters thought they were preserving their divine blood. Instead, they were destroying their genetic future. They gained political stability at the cost of biological viability. They created closed systems that were powerful but ultimately unsustainable. And in the end, that might be the most important lesson of all. Power that becomes too concentrated, authority that becomes too isolated, and systems that become too closed are ultimately self-defeating. They might succeed for generations, but they inevitably fail. The family that ruled by incest became the family that died by incest. The last Ptolemy died alone in Alexandria. The last Inca was executed by Spanish conquistadors, and the last Habsburg king of Spain died without an heir. Their divine blood, preserved so carefully through generations of sibling marriage, simply ran out. Their family trees, so carefully maintained as family circles, finally collapsed under the weight of their own genetic contradictions. But their story endures, not as a celebration of royal power, but as a reminder of its limits. Even gods, it turns out, are subject to the laws of genetics. Even emperors can't escape the consequences of their choices. And even the most powerful families eventually face the same fate as everyone else. They become history. The Palace of Alexandria is now underwater. The great library is gone. The temples of the sun god are ruins. But the story of the emperor who married his sister lives on, a testament to human ambition, human folly, and the eternal tension between power and biology. It's a story that reminds us that no matter how divine we think we are, we're still just human. And humans, even royal ones, are subject to the same biological laws as everyone else. The family that ruled by incest learned this lesson too late. But perhaps if we remember their story, we can learn it in time. In the dusty archives of the Vatican, there exists a letter that most historians pretend doesn't exist. Written in 1493 by Pope Alexander VI, it grants his son, Cesare Borgia, permission to marry his own sister Lucrezia. The letter was never sent. The marriage never happened. But the document reveals something chilling about power and its ability to corrupt even the most sacred institutions. When you have enough authority, even the laws of God become suggestions. The Borgias weren't technically a ruling dynasty, but they were something perhaps more dangerous. A family that treated the Catholic Church like their personal kingdom. Rodrigo Borgia, who became Pope Alexander VI, turned the papal court into a Renaissance soap opera where nepotism, murder, and incest were just another Tuesday. His children, Cesare and Lucrezia, were rumored to be lovers as well as siblings. Whether the rumors were true or simply the product of their enemies' imaginations, they reveal how easily power can slip from divine authority into divine decadence. Lucretia Borgia, beautiful and intelligent, became a pawn in her father's political games. She was married 3 times before she turned 21, each marriage designed to advance Borgia family interests. When her husbands became inconvenient, they died mysterious deaths. When her brothers became too possessive, she was shipped off to distant courts. The line between political alliance and personal relationship blurred until it disappeared entirely. But the Borgias were pikers compared to the Julio-Claudian dynasty that ruled Rome during its imperial golden age. Here, incest wasn't just practiced, it was elevated to high art. The first Roman emperor, Augustus, married his stepdaughter Julia to his stepson Tiberius. When that marriage failed, he married her to his nephew Marcellus. When Marcellus died, he married her to his general Agrippa. Julia's reproductive life was essentially a strategic chess game played by her stepfather with her body as the board. But Augustus was restrained compared to his successors. Tiberius, his stepson and heir, retreated to the island of Capri, where he allegedly engaged in sexual practices so depraved that Roman historians, who weren't exactly prudes, refused to describe them in detail. He adopted his nephew Caligula, who would become the most notorious emperor in Roman history. Caligula's reign was brief but memorable. He declared himself a god, demanded worship from senators, and according to multiple historical sources, engaged in sexual relationships with all 3 of his sisters. He didn't just sleep with them. He pimped them out to other men, then publicly shamed them for their promiscuity. When his favorite sister Drusilla died, he declared her a goddess and made sleeping with her a form of religious worship. Rome had seen cruel emperors before, but never one who combined political power with such systematic sexual depravity. The pattern continued with Claudius, who married his niece Agrippina the Younger. This required changing Roman law, which had previously forbidden uncle-niece marriages. Claudius justified the change by claiming it was necessary for the good of the empire. Agrippina, ambitious and ruthless, used her position to advance her son Nero's claim to the throne. When Claudius hesitated to name Nero as his heir, Agrippina allegedly poisoned him with mushrooms. Mother love, Roman style. Nero's relationship with his mother was complicated. Roman historians claim that Agrippina was so determined to control her son that she seduced him. Whether this actually happened or was just political propaganda, it reveals how incest had become a weapon in the arsenal of imperial politics. By Nero's time, accusations of incest were so common that they had lost their shock value. Romans expected their emperors to be sexually depraved. It was almost part of the job description. The psychological damage was evident. Nero was paranoid, violent, and increasingly detached from reality. He murdered his mother, his wife, and countless senators. He declared himself a god and forced the Roman elite to worship him. He performed on stage, something no respectable Roman would ever do, and demanded applause from audiences who were terrified to displease him. When Rome burned in 64 CE, rumors spread that Nero had started the fire himself just to clear space for his new palace. The Julio-Claudian dynasty ended when Nero committed suicide in 68 CE, but the damage was done. The idea that emperors were above normal human laws, including laws about sexual behavior, had become embedded in Roman imperial culture. Later, emperors might not have been as extreme as Caligula or Nero, but they inherited a system where absolute power included absolute sexual license. This brings us to one of history's most disturbing examples of royal incest, the Sassanid dynasty of Persia. The Sassanids, who ruled from 224 to 651 CE, took the Zoroastrian concept of Izwedoda, or next of kin marriage, and turned it into state policy. Unlike the Ptolemies, who practiced sibling marriage primarily, the Sassanids were equal opportunity incestors. They married siblings, parents, children, and any combination thereof. The Sassanid king Khosrow II, who ruled from 590 to 628 CE, married his daughter Purandakt, his sister Gordafarid, and his stepdaughter Shirin. He didn't just collect wives, he collected relatives. His court was a maze of family relationships so complex that even the royal genealogists couldn't keep track. Children were simultaneously siblings, cousins, and step-relatives. The family tree looked like a DNA pretzel. But the Sassanids had a theological justification that was more sophisticated than simple divine kingship. Zoroastrian doctrine taught that the cosmos was engaged in an eternal struggle between good and evil. The royal family, as representatives of Ahura Mazda, the good god, had to maintain the purity of light against the corruption of darkness. Marrying outside the family wasn't just politically dangerous. It was cosmically catastrophic. It would literally bring about the end of the world. This religious framework allowed the Sassanids to practice incest on a scale that shocked even their contemporaries. Byzantine historians, who were hardly strangers to imperial corruption, described the Sassanid court as a place where natural law has been perverted into unnatural custom. Arab conquerors who would eventually destroy the Sassanid Empire used the dynasty's incestuous practices as justification for their invasion. They weren't just conquering territory, they were purifying the world. The genetic consequences were predictable. Later, Sassanid rulers suffered from the same problems as other incestuous dynasties: physical deformities, mental illness, and reproductive failure. The dynasty's last king, Yazdegerd III, was described by contemporary sources as weak in body and mind, unable to rule or fight. When the Arab armies arrived in 636 CE, the Sassanid resistance collapsed almost immediately. An empire that had lasted for 4 centuries was destroyed in less than 20 years. The Arab conquest of Persia marked the end of the last great incestuous empire of the ancient world. Islam, like Judaism and Christianity, strictly forbade incest of any kind. The new rulers dismantled the Sassanid marriage system and imposed Islamic law, which limited marriage to distant relatives at most. The cosmic justification for royal incest disappeared along with the dynasty that had created it. But incest didn't disappear from royal politics. It just became more subtle. The medieval European nobility developed a system of cousin marriage that was technically legal but genetically dangerous. The key was staying within the boundaries of church law while maximizing family consolidation. First cousin marriage was forbidden, but second cousin marriage was acceptable. Third cousin marriage was encouraged. Fourth cousin marriage was ideal. This created a web of intermarriage that was less intense than the Ptolemaic system but more pervasive. European nobility became a closed genetic community where everyone was related to everyone else through multiple bloodlines. The Plantagenets, Capetians, and Habsburgs weren't just political allies, they were cousins, second cousins, and third cousins. Royal marriage wasn't about love or even politics. It was about maintaining membership in an exclusive genetic club. The results were visible in medieval art and literature. Royal portraits show the characteristic features of inbreeding: elongated faces, prominent jaws, and distinctive noses. The Habsburg jaw, the Bourbon nose, and the Plantagenet chin became family trademarks, genetic signatures that marked their bearers as members of the ruling class. Physical deformity became a sign of aristocratic authenticity. But the most systematic practitioners of strategic incest were the Egyptian pharaohs who preceded the Ptolemies. The native Egyptian dynasties had been practicing sibling marriage for over 2,000 years before Alexander the Great arrived. The Ptolemies didn't invent pharaonic incest. They inherited it, and the Egyptian precedent was both more extreme and more successful than anything the Ptolemies achieved. The pharaoh Amenhotep II, who ruled during the 18th dynasty, married his sister Sitimun, his daughter Iset, and his granddaughter Nebeta. He didn't just practice incest, he practiced multi-generational incest. His family tree was a closed loop where every generation married into the previous generation. The result was a bloodline so concentrated that it was essentially genetically uniform. But somehow, this system worked. The 18th dynasty produced some of Egypt's greatest pharaohs: Hatshepsut, Thutmose III, Amenhotep III, and Akhenaten. These rulers expanded Egypt's empire, built magnificent monuments, and presided over a golden age of art and culture. Their genetic isolation didn't prevent them from being effective leaders. It may have enhanced their effectiveness by creating a distinctive royal identity. The key was that Egyptian pharaohs weren't just political leaders, they were living gods. Their subjects didn't expect them to be normal humans. They expected them to be divine beings who existed outside normal human categories. Physical abnormalities weren't defects, they were marks of divine favor. Mental illness wasn't madness, it was sacred inspiration. Reproductive problems weren't failures, they were proof that the gods were too holy to reproduce like mortals. This ideological framework allowed the Egyptian pharaohs to practice incest for over 3 millennia. From the early dynastic period around 3100 BCE to the Roman conquest in 30 BCE, pharaonic incest was a constant feature of Egyptian royal culture. No other civilization maintained such a system for so long or with such consistency. The secret was religion. Egyptian theology taught that the pharaoh was the living embodiment of the god Horus, son of Isis and Osiris. But Isis and Osiris were siblings who had married each other. The pharaoh's incestuous marriage wasn't just politically convenient. It was religiously necessary. He had to marry his sister because the gods had married their siblings. He was reenacting cosmic mythology in human form. This religious justification was supported by elaborate rituals, artistic representations, and architectural monuments. The Great Pyramid of Giza, built for the pharaoh Khufu around 2580 BCE, is aligned with astronomical features that reflect the marriage of divine siblings. The walls of Egyptian temples are covered with images of pharaohs and their sister wives performing sacred rituals. The entire visual culture of ancient Egypt was designed to normalize and celebrate incestuous marriage. But the Egyptians were also pragmatic. They understood that excessive inbreeding could be dangerous, so they developed strategies to minimize genetic risk while maintaining ideological purity. Pharaohs typically had multiple wives, including foreign princesses and noble daughters. Their sister wife was the official queen, but she wasn't necessarily their only sexual partner. This allowed them to maintain genetic diversity while preserving religious orthodoxy. The Egyptians also practiced strategic adoption, bringing talented individuals into the royal family regardless of their blood relationships. Military leaders, priests, and administrators could be adopted as royal children and given positions of authority. This created a system where genetic inheritance was balanced by meritocratic selection. The pharaoh might marry his sister, but he could also elevate capable outsiders to positions of power. This flexibility explains why the Egyptian system lasted so much longer than other incestuous dynasties. The Ptolemies, Incas, and Habsburgs created closed systems that couldn't adapt to changing circumstances. The native Egyptian pharaohs created a system that was ideologically rigid but practically flexible. They maintained their divine identity while allowing for genetic and political innovation. The Roman conquest of Egypt in 30 BCE ended the longest-running incestuous dynasty in human history. But the psychological and cultural legacy persisted. The idea that rulers were fundamentally different from their subjects, that they existed outside normal human categories, that they were subject to different laws and different expectations. These concepts survived the fall of the pharaohs and influenced political thought for centuries. Medieval European concepts of divine right kingship drew heavily on Egyptian precedents. The idea that kings ruled by divine appointment, that they were answerable only to God, that they possessed sacred authority that couldn't be challenged by mere mortals. These were all concepts that originated in pharaonic Egypt. The incestuous marriage system was abandoned, but the ideological framework that justified it persisted. This brings us to one of the most disturbing aspects of royal incest: its psychological impact on the children who were its products. Being the result of sibling marriage, parent-child union, or other forms of incest, created unique psychological pressures that went far beyond the genetic risks. These children grew up knowing that their very existence was controversial, that their conception had violated normal human boundaries, and that their identity was tied to practices that most people found abhorrent. The psychological profiles of famous products of royal incest reveal consistent patterns. They were often paranoid, believing that everyone was plotting against them. They were grandiose, convinced of their own divine nature and superior to normal humans. They were impulsive, unable to control their desires or consider long-term consequences. They were isolated, unable to form normal relationships with people outside their immediate family. Caligula, the product of multiple generations of Roman imperial inbreeding, displayed all these characteristics. He was convinced that he was a god, that normal laws didn't apply to him, and that everyone who opposed him deserved death. He was unable to distinguish between political opposition and personal betrayal. He treated the Roman Senate like his personal entertainment committee, and the Roman people like his personal property. Akhenaten, the pharaoh who revolutionized Egyptian religion, was the product of sibling marriage and possibly father-daughter incest. His radical reforms, which included abandoning Egypt's traditional gods and moving the capital to a new city, may have been the result of psychological instability caused by his genetic heritage. His artistic representations show physical abnormalities consistent with genetic disorders, and his behavior patterns suggest mental illness. Charles II of Spain, the last Habsburg king, was so inbred that he was mentally disabled. He couldn't speak clearly, couldn't walk without assistance, and couldn't produce an heir. Court records describe him as simple-minded and melancholy, unable to understand the basic requirements of kingship. His death without an heir triggered a European war that lasted 13 years and killed hundreds of thousands of people. These examples reveal the human cost of royal incest. Behind the political calculations and religious justifications were real people whose lives were damaged by their genetic heritage. They were victims of a system that prioritized political stability over human welfare, that treated children as political tools rather than individuals with their own rights and needs. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of royal incest was its impact on the women who were forced to participate. Royal daughters, sisters, and mothers were treated as breeding stock, their reproductive capacity viewed as a political resource to be managed and controlled. They had no choice about whom they married, when they married, or how many children they produced. Their bodies were literally owned by the state. Cleopatra VII, despite her intelligence and political skill, was still trapped in this system. She was married to her first brother when she was 18 and he was 10. When he became politically inconvenient, she had him murdered and married her second brother. Her personal desires, her emotional needs, her physical health, None of these mattered compared to the political requirements of maintaining Ptolemaic power. The psychological toll on these women was enormous. Many developed what we would now recognize as symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, anxiety, paranoia, and difficulty forming healthy relationships. They were simultaneously the most powerful women in their societies and the most powerless, able to command armies and issue decrees, but unable to control their own reproductive lives. Some fought back. Hatshepsut, one of the few female pharaohs, refused to marry her brother and instead ruled as a single woman. She was so successful that later pharaohs tried to erase her from the historical record. Agrippina the Younger used her position as Claudius's wife to advance her son's career, then allegedly murdered her husband when he became inconvenient. These women found ways to exercise agency within a system designed to deny them agency, but most had no choice but to submit. They were born into a system that viewed them as political assets, raised to accept their role as reproductive tools, and conditioned to believe that their personal sacrifice was necessary for the good of the dynasty. The psychological damage was passed down through generations, creating a cycle of abuse that was almost impossible to break. This gendered dimension of royal incest is often overlooked in historical accounts that focus on political and genetic consequences, but it reveals something important about the nature of power and its relationship to human sexuality. Incestuous dynasties weren't just genetically isolated, they were sexually oppressive. They created closed systems where women's bodies were controlled by male relatives, where consent was irrelevant, and where personal autonomy was subordinated to political necessity. The fall of these dynasties represented not just political change, but sexual liberation. When the Romans conquered Egypt, when the Spanish conquered the Incas, when the Arabs conquered Persia, they didn't just impose new forms of government. They liberated women from systems of sexual oppression. The genetic consequences of royal incest were catastrophic, but the gender consequences were equally devastating. This brings us to the final and perhaps most important lesson of royal incest, its revelation of the corrupting influence of absolute power. These dynasties didn't start out practicing incest. They evolved into it gradually as their power increased and their connection to normal human society decreased. The more isolated they became, the more extreme their practices became. The pattern was consistent across cultures and centuries. Early rulers married within their extended families, but also maintained connections to the broader nobility. Middle period rulers narrowed their marriage choices to immediate relatives, but still interacted with non-royal advisors and officials. Late period rulers married their siblings, children, and parents, while becoming increasingly isolated from anyone outside their immediate family. This progression reveals how power corrupts not just through the temptation to abuse others, but through the temptation to separate oneself from the normal human community. When you have enough power, you begin to believe that normal rules don't apply to you. When you have absolute power, you begin to believe that you're not even the same species as everyone else. The incestuous dynasties took this logic to its ultimate conclusion. They didn't just believe they were above human law, they believed they were above human nature. They created closed systems where the only reality was their own family, where the only relationships that mattered were genetic relationships, where the only future that existed was the continuation of their bloodline. But this isolation was ultimately self-defeating. Cut off from the broader human community, these dynasties lost touch with the social, economic, and military realities that determined their survival. They became so focused on maintaining genetic purity that they forgot to maintain political effectiveness. They created perfect, closed systems that were perfectly vulnerable to external challenge. The lesson is clear. Power that becomes too concentrated inevitably becomes self-destructive. Whether it's genetic concentration, political concentration, or ideological concentration, closed systems are inherently unstable. They might succeed in the short term, but they inevitably fail in the long term. The emperors who married their sisters thought they were creating permanent dynasties. Instead, they created temporary aberrations that burned brightly and died quickly. Their genetic purity became genetic poverty. Their political isolation became political weakness. Their divine pretensions became human disasters. And in the end, that might be the most important lesson of all. We are all human, regardless of our power, our wealth, or our pretensions. We are all subject to the same biological laws, the same psychological needs, and the same social realities. The rulers who forgot this lesson paid the ultimate price. Their dynasties died, their empires fell, and their names became cautionary tales. But the story doesn't end with their fall. It continues with our memory of their rise and fall, our understanding of their successes and failures, and our determination to learn from their mistakes. The family that ruled by incest is gone, but their story remains as a reminder of the dangers of absolute power and the importance of maintaining our connection to the broader human community. Because in the end, we are all family. Not in the narrow genetic sense that the incestuous dynasties understood, but in the broad human sense that they forgot. We are all related through our shared humanity, our common vulnerabilities, and our mutual dependence on each other. The rulers who forgot this truth paid the ultimate price. Perhaps, if we remember their story, we can avoid repeating their mistakes.